The path of the red blood cell. Red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, are the most common type of blood cell. They are produced inside the bones in the bone marrow. They live for approximately 120 days before they die. The blood cell's key function is to carry oxygen throughout the body and remove carbon dioxide. Blood cells are rounded and relatively flat in comparison to other cells and feature an indented center, as you can see here. Nutrition plays a critical role in the health of these blood cells, as their development requires sufficient levels of nutrients and vitamins such as iron, vitamin E, B2, B12, and B3. Red blood cells do not have a nucleus, are covered with a lipid and protein-composing membrane, and contain hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the molecule in a red blood cell that carries oxygen to the tissues and returns carbon dioxide to the lungs. Hemoglobin is composed of 4 protein molecules called globulin chains that are interconnected. Each of these chains contains the porphyrin compound called heme, which includes an iron atom that is responsible for binding oxygen. When hemoglobin is oxygenated, it is called oxyhemoglobin and appears bright red. When oxygen levels are in a reduced state, it appears to be a purplish red in color. Iron is the primary contributor to the red color of blood. Hemoglobin contributes to the maintenance of the shape of the red blood cell. An abnormal hemoglobin structure can alter the shape of the red blood cell and diminish its ability to flow through blood vessels. When red blood cells die, their hemoglobin is broken up. The iron is salvaged and sent to the bone marrow to be recycled. The rest of the hemoglobin forms bilirubin, which is a chemical excreted into the bile, giving feces its usual color. The oxidation of cells is a source of energy for most mammals. Oxygen is involved in a process called cell respiration, in which a glucose molecule and an oxygen molecule are converted into water, carbon dioxide, and adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. ATP is the main source of chemical energy for most cells and is responsible for many cellular processes. This reaction occurs in the organelle mitochondria, which is nicknamed the powerhouse of the cell. The oxygen required for this reaction is attained via the circulatory and respiratory systems. While oxygen is abundant and available, aerobic respiration occurs. When there is a deficit of available oxygen, anaerobic respiration occurs. Aerobic respiration is much more effective in producing ATP than anaerobic respiration, demonstrating the importance of oxygen. There are 2 processes which enable the flow of blood throughout the body. First, we have pulmonary circulation. This is blood circulation between the heart and the lungs. Oxygen-reduced blood cells move from the right ventricle of the heart to the lungs, where red blood cells gain oxygen and travel to the left atrium of the heart. Secondly, we have systemic circulation. This is blood circulation between the heart and body in order to give oxygen and nutrients to the tissues, while also returning deoxygenated blood back to the heart to undergo pulmonary circulation. Let's begin the path of the red blood cell with the right atrium, which receives blood that has already been circulated through the body. It receives the blood from the body through the superior and inferior vena cava, depending on which part of the body it is returning from. The blood then passes from the right atrium to the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. The right ventricle pumps the blood through the pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary arteries to be oxidized by the lungs. Gas exchange occurs in the lungs. Capillaries line small sacs called alveoli. Carbon dioxide, in which the blood is full of at this point in the system due to cellular respiration, is diffused through the capillaries and oxygen is absorbed by the blood cells. This gas exchange happens as a result of a gas partial pressure gradient across the alveoli and the capillaries. The difference between the partial pressures of the gases allow the infusion of oxygen and the diffusion of carbon dioxide as the gas molecules move from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration as the gases exchange. The blood cells are then pumped back to the heart via the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. The oxygen-rich blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle via the mitral valve. This is where pulmonary circulatory system ends and the systemic circulation begins. The left ventricle, which is very powerful, contracts and is responsible for systemic circulation. The oxygenated blood is pumped throughout the entire body. To do this, it passes through the aortic valve and the aorta, which is the body's largest artery. The blood passes through the aortic arches and branches, which branch and circulate blood to the entire body. The blood cells reach whichever organ or part of the body it is intended for through various arteries, and diffuses the oxygen and nutrients to the target through capillaries, while absorbing carbon dioxide. This process is very similar to the diffusion of CO2 in the lungs, but in reverse. Metabolic waste and carbon dioxide are diffused out of the cell and into the blood, and oxygen and glucose are diffused out of the blood and into the cell to be used for cell respiration. Arteries are displayed in red and veins in blue. The blood then returns to the heart via veins and is pumped back into the right atrium via the superior and inferior vena cava. Systemic circulation is a higher pressure circuit than pulmonary circulation because it requires greater force to transport higher volumes of blood farther throughout the body. What could affect blood flow? The most common red blood cell disease is anemia, which can exist in many different forms. Anemia describes the condition when there aren't enough red blood cells to carry the appropriate amount of oxygen in the body. Further, the red blood cells themselves often appear to have an unusual shape. It is important to note that some red blood cell diseases are hereditary, whereas others are caused by illness or lack of iron or vitamins. Common types of anemia include iron deficiency anemia, whereby your body doesn't produce enough red blood cells due to deficient iron levels. This is the most common form of anemia, and it's caused by diets low in iron, chronic loss of blood, or an insufficient absorption of iron from food. There's also sickle cell anemia. This is an inherited hereditary disease which affects the shape of the red blood cell. With sickle cell anemia, the red blood cells, known as sickle cells, look like crescents instead of the rounded shape of the healthy red blood cells. Due to the abnormal shape, sickle cells aren't able to flow smoothly through the blood vessels, which can cause blockages. These blockages may result in acute or chronic pain and potential infection or liver damage. Sickle cells die much more quickly than healthy blood cells, in 10 to 20 days. As a result, the supply of red blood cells cannot keep up with demand. An individual's blood type is determined by their biological parents, as it is inherited genetically. Blood types can be broken down into two groups to label each type in a way that is recognized and understood worldwide. One group of organization is by letter. The three letters are A, B, and O, and together they make four different types, as follows: A, B, AB, and O. The other way to group is based on the Rh factor, which distinguishes within each of the group mentioned above as positive or negative. This makes for a total of 8 different possible blood types. AB positive is a universal recipient, meaning that an individual with type AB positive blood can receive blood transfusion from anybody with any blood type. O negative is a universal donor, meaning that their blood is not rejected by an individual with any given blood type. The reason for acceptance or rejection of a blood transfusion is based on antigens and antibodies for each blood type. An antigen is a substance that controls which antibodies are created. So in the blood, the antigen defines one's blood type by creating antibodies to other blood types. As an example, antigen A causes the production of anti-B antibody, which rejects type B blood. That means that an individual with type A blood can only receive the transfusion from somebody with type A or O blood, but nothing with type B blood, due to the anti-B antibody in the blood. Some questions for our TA. How does blood without hemoglobin transport oxygen? For example, the icefish or snails have blood but lack hemoglobin. Since the main function of hemoglobin is to carry oxygen, how do these animals transport it without? A subset of that question is, are other forms of oxygenation possible? In essence, can an organism oxygenate without the use of blood? Do processes like this exist on Earth? Also, we know that red blood cells typically survive for around 120 days and are formed in the bone marrow. What happens to them when they die, and where do they break down?